Okay, let's get into this. We all, see the physical differences between men and women. Pretty obvious.
Right. Clear as day.
But then there's the brain. Our
Mm.
thoughts, feelings, creativity. It
Yeah.
all comes from there. And for ages, the idea was, well, it's basically the same machine in everyone.
Yeah, this sort of androgynous brain concept, despite everything else being biologically distinct.
Makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? Is
Yeah.
that really the full picture?
Well, that's exactly it. That assumption that the brain is somehow exempt from sex differences has been the prevailing view for a long time.
Which brings us right here to this deep dive. You sent over The Female Brain, the second edition by Cynthia Darlington, and we're going to unpack it.
Mm-hmm.
We're pushing past the usual societal stuff and looking at the biology. What does the science in this book say about actual structural and functional differences?
Exactly. And it's not about pushing stereotypes. It's about the underlying neurobiology. Darlington looks at the brain's structure, the neuroanatomy.
The hardware.
Right, and also the neurochemistry, the chemicals, the processes, and even how conditions, neurological or psychiatric ones, might show up differently based on sex.
So the software, too, how it runs.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Hardware and software.
Okay, so our mission today, pull out the key findings from Darlington's book, give you, our listener, a solid, clear grasp of the research. We're aiming for those aha moments, explained simply. No getting bogged down in jargon.
And Darlington kicks off with a really fundamental question. Given all the other physical sex differences, why was the brain treated as this exception for so long?
Yeah, that historical angle is interesting. The book points out how discussions about gender roles, how we're raised, kind of overshadowed the basic biology questions for ages.
The nurture versus nature debate, basically.
Right. The argument was offered, any differences we see are just upbringing, which makes it super hard to untangle culture from biology.
But as the book stresses, that doesn't actually answer the core biological question. Are there functional differences?
And if there are,
Do they come from the structure itself being different, the hardware? Or is it the same hardware running differently, different software?
or probably a bit of both.
That's usually how biology works, yeah. A complex interplay.
So to start digging into that, the book lays out the main hormones, estrogen and progesterone in females, testosterone in males.
But, and this is key, estrogen isn't just female. It can actually be made from testosterone in both sexes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's crucial. These hormones, estrogen comes in a few main forms like estradiol, estrone, estriol. They, along with progesterone, are all built from cholesterol, actually.
Cholesterol as the starting block. Got it.
Yeah, through a whole series of biochemical steps.
And for women, these hormone levels aren't static, are they? They cycle.
That's a defining feature. Estrogen rises early in the menstrual cycle, peaks around ovulation, dips, has another smaller rise, then falls off.
It's quite the roller coaster.
It really is. And then progesterone kicks in after ovulation, released by the corpus luteum. If there's no pregnancy, its level drops too, and that triggers menstruation.
So this constant ebb and flow is really central.
Absolutely. The cyclical nature is fundamental to female physiology.
Okay, shifting slightly. The book gives a quick rundown of the central nervous system, the CNS.
Which isn't just the brain, right? Includes the spinal cord too.
Exactly. The spinal cord is like the information highway. Sensory stuff goes up to the brain.
Loader commands come back down to muscles, glands, everything.
And the brain itself is the CPU, the processor, analyzing inputs, mixing them with memory.
And then deciding on a response. Could be conscious, like choosing lunch, or totally unconscious, like pulling your hand from heat.
And the brain's got its main sections. The cortex, that wrinkly outer part for complex thought.
Then the diencephalon underneath, the brainstem connecting to the spinal cord, and the cerebellum tucked in the back.
And the cortex is split in two, left and right hemispheres. Left often linked to logic, right to creativity. Though that's a bit simplistic sometimes.
It is, but a useful starting point. And those hemispheres are divided into lobes: frontal for planning, temporal for memory and sound, parietal for senses, occipital for vision.
And within those lobes, you have areas for basic stuff feeding into areas for more complex processing.
A whole hierarchy of processing.
Definitely. Then the book zooms right down to the neuron, the brain cell doing the work.
Your basic building block for transmitting information.
Got the dendrites picking up signals, the cell body or soma processing them, and the axon carrying the signal away.
As an electrical pulse, the action potential.
Down to the synapse, that tiny gap.
Exactly. And at the synapse, the electrical signal triggers the release of chemicals, neurotransmitters,
They jump the gap, bind to receptors on the next neuron.
and pass the message along. And those receptors can be clustered in specific spots or spread more widely.
And here's where it gets really juicy. The book mentions hormones and neurotransmitters can interact right there at the receptors.
Yeah, it flags this as especially important during brain development, though the book doesn't dive super deep into development itself. It's a fascinating area of research.
It also gives a nod to the science behind it all, mentioning techniques like RT-PCR.
Which is basically a way scientists can see which genes are switched on in brain cells, helps understand what's being produced.
Shows the rigor. Yeah.
Definitely. And finally, in that intro section, Darlington set some terms, using estrogen generally, unless a specific type like estradiol matters,
Makes it easier to read.
and focusing references on recent or really key older studies to keep it manageable.
Okay, so if we loop back, this context connects directly to the next chapter, doesn't it? The history of excluding women from research.
It really does. Understanding that history helps explain why we're maybe behind where we could be in understanding these differences. What struck you about that section?
Oh, it was pretty stark. The reasons given for leaving women out of medical studies, perceived frailty, the complication of the menstrual cycle, worries about pregnancy.
It seems unbelievable looking back, doesn't it?
Totally. And the irony, as the book points out.
Is that even though they were excluded from testing, drugs tested only on men were then often given to women anyway, pregnant women included.
Without specific data on how it might affect them. It's wild.
And Darlington even floats the idea of a historical power shift, men taking over healing roles, possibly contributing to less focus on women's health overall, brain included.
So these biases, plus the genuine complexities of female physiology, created this big knowledge gap.
A significant lag, for sure.
Okay. Moving to the physical brain itself. Chapter 3 gets into structure, the architecture of difference.
Right, looking at it on different scales, what you can see, what's under the microscope, down to the molecules and cells.
And it does a quick biology refresh, diploid cells with full chromosomes, haploid gametes, sperm egg with half.
Mitosis for cell division, and the XX female versus XY male chromosome basics, that Y chromosome being the decider for male sex.
Now, brain size. The book states males tend to have larger brains on average.
But, and this is a big but, it emphasizes.
Don't equate size with function. Bigger doesn't automatically mean better or even different processing power.
Exactly. What might be more telling are differences in proportions of gray and white matter.
Ah, right. Some studies suggest females have a higher percentage of gray matter, the neuron cell bodies, the processing centers.
While males tend to have a higher percentage of white matter, the myelinated axons, the wiring connecting regions.
And there was also mention of neuronal density.
Yeah, some reports suggest males have more neurons packed into a given space, and maybe more neurons overall, but the book notes these findings aren't perfectly consistent across all studies. It's tricky stuff.
Another point, asymmetry. We know the right hemisphere is often slightly larger, but Darlington reports female brains tend to be more symmetrical, especially in areas linked to language and handedness.
Which is fascinating. And it's worth remembering, as the book points out, our ability to see this in living brains with MRI and stuff is pretty new.
Right. Before that, it was mostly preserved brains post-mortem.
And the preservation itself could potentially introduce artifacts or obscure subtle differences. Modern imaging is a huge leap forward.
So, Chapter 4 flips from structure to function. Neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, the chemical messengers.
But it starts by saying the line between structure and function gets blurry, especially with receptors.
How so?
Because receptors are physical structures, proteins on the cell, but their numbers, where they are, how sensitive they are, that can all change. They're dynamic.
So there's structure and function rolled into one, almost.
Pretty much. They're incredibly flexible, key to how the brain adapts and works.
And a huge breakthrough mentioned here. Finding steroid hormone receptors in the brain back in '68.
Massive. It meant hormones floating in the blood could get past the blood-brain barrier and directly tweak brain cells.
So suddenly, hormone levels weren't just affecting the body, they were directly affecting brain function behavior.
Exactly. It opened up a whole new way of thinking. Before that, researchers knew certain areas like the hypothalamus and limbic system were involved in sexual behavior.
From older techniques like stimulating areas or studying damage.
Right, so those areas became the prime candidates for where these hormone receptors might be hiding.
And over the next decade or so, they found them. Receptors for stress hormones, androgens like testosterone, and estrogens.
And different types of receptors with unique distribution patterns in the brain, suggesting different jobs in different places.
Focusing on estrogen, there are two main types, ER-alpha and ER-beta.
ERA and ERA, yeah. Found mainly in that limbic system, amygdala for emotions, hypothalamus for basic functions.
And initially, research in rats found similar numbers and locations in males and females.
Generally similar, yes, which makes the functional differences even more interesting.
The book talks about knockout models then, mice bred without a specific gene.
Right, a powerful tool. They made mice lacking the ERI receptor. Surprisingly, they survived.
That had problems.
Big problems with sexual behavior, yes, but also importantly with spatial learning. Things like navigating mazes.
So even with similar receptor distribution initially, their function, or the consequences of them not being there, differed.
Precisely. Which leads into how estrogen interacts with the big neurotransmitter systems. GABA, serotonin, dopamine.
And these are implicated in conditions like anxiety, depression, psychosis, where we sometimes see sex differences in prevalence or symptoms.
Exactly. So the interactions are really relevant. Let's take GABA first. Gamma-aminobutyric acid.
The main inhibitory one calms things down.
That's the one. Its receptors are everywhere. And crucially, the main type, the GABA receptor complex,
Which is what alcohol and sedatives target.
also has binding sites for steroids, including estrogen.
So estrogen can fiddle with GABA activity.
It seems so. Maybe by affecting GABA levels or transport. And interestingly, studies found higher GABA activity in parts of the male rat hypothalamus compared to females.
Okay, then serotonin.
Yeah.
Involved in, well, loads of things. Sleep, pain, mood.
And depression, famously. SSRI antidepressants work by keeping serotonin active longer in the synapse.
And dopamine.
Dopamine works through distinct pathways. One for movement, that's the one hit in Parkinson's.
Okay.
Others for reward, motivation implicated in psychosis, and another regulating the hormone prolactin.
And estrogen influences dopamine too.
Animal studies show it does. But human studies looking at dopamine transporters, the things that clear dopamine away, have given mixed results on sex differences or changes across the menstrual cycle. It's complex.
To see the bigger picture of brain activity, the book mentions things like EEG, PT, fMRI.
Right. EEG measures electrical waves from the scalp. PET uses tracers to map active areas. And fMRI tracks blood flow changes as a proxy for activity. Gives great spatial detail.
And fMRI studies looking at emotion processing.
Have found that males and females can show different activation patterns, like using different hemispheres more or less for certain emotional tasks, suggests functional differences in how emotions are handled.
Okay, Chapter 5 moves into psychological sex differences, and it
Yeah.
starts with a caution. Designing good experiments here is really hard.
Oh, absolutely. Controlling for every little variable in human thought and behavior. Much trickier than a simple lab test. Even how you ask the question matters.
One classic example is pregnancy brain, the idea that thinking gets fuzzy during pregnancy.
Right, lots of anecdotes about forgetfulness. But the science, kind of mixed.
The book mentions a study where pregnant women didn't report big cognitive changes themselves.
And neither did their partners notice any, which contrasts with the common perception.
But in visual perception, some patterns seem more consistent.
Yeah, things like mental rotation tasks, picturing objects turning in space, males often perform better.
Whereas females often show an edge in remembering where objects are located spatially.
Which some researchers link back to potential evolutionary roles, like remembering food locations in a gatherer context. Speculative, but interesting.
What about smell and taste? Is the idea that women have a better sense of smell true?
The research is actually a bit murky on a general superiority, methodological challenges maybe. But some studies do find differences for specific smells.
Like musk and banana oil, the book mentioned. Females more sensitive.
That was one finding, yeah. And pregnancy definitely throws smell perception for a loop.
Things suddenly smell awful.
Exactly. But interestingly, one study found that self-reported heightened smell sensitivity in pregnant women didn't always match their test results.
Suggesting maybe it's not the raw sensitivity changing, but how the brain interprets the smell.
It's one possibility, yeah. A change in processing or evaluation.
And touch. Any differences there?
Subtle ones reported. Similar detection thresholds for vibration, maybe, but females tending to rate stronger vibrations as feeling more intense.
And maybe sensitivity changes across the menstrual cycle too.
Some evidence suggests that yes, fluctuations in tactile perception.
Numerical skills, calculations and stuff.
Some findings point to females being faster at calculations, though not necessarily more accurate always.
And that mental dice task. suppressing automatic counting.
Right. That study found females showed more automatic counting tendencies in the premenstrual phase, suggests cyclical influences even on basic numerical processing.
Lastly in this bit, episodic memory, remembering specific events.
Often reported as a female advantage, possibly tied to stronger verbal skills, which help encode and retrieve memories. Studies looked at recalling words, but also remembering spatial layouts.
Which leads nicely into Chapter 6, laterality, brain asymmetry.
The whole left brain, right brain idea, hugely popular concept.
But maybe oversimplified.
Definitely. The book stresses the reality is far more complex than just logic left, creative right.
A lot of our understanding comes from lesion studies, right? Brain damage.
Yes, seeing what functions are lost when a specific area is damaged. But interpreting those changes accurately can be difficult. The brain is interconnected.
The book highlights that fMRI study on reading, Shaywitz.
That's the one. Found similar accuracy in males and females, but different brain activity patterns.
Females more bilateral using both sides.
Tended towards more bilateral activation, yeah. While males showed more left-lateralized activity, especially in that inferior frontal gyrus region.
And processing emotional faces.
Studies suggest the right hemisphere might be more dominant for negative emotions, like sadness or fear. And there's a hint, females might rate those negative expressions as more intense than males do.
But crucially, the book says you have to consider the menstrual cycle when studying laterality in women.
Absolutely essential. Research shows hormonal shifts across the cycle can influence which hemisphere takes the lead on certain tasks, both verbal and nonverbal.
Suggesting the right hemisphere might be particularly tuned in to those hormonal changes.
That's one interpretation suggested by some studies, yeah. Greater sensitivity to hormone fluctuations.
The chapter mentions some theories too, different processing styles, or that double filtering by frequency idea.
Briefly touches on them, and the global versus local processing debate in vision. Just reinforcing that how the hemispheres divide labor is still an active area of research and theory.
Okay, next up, Chapter 7, Neurology, Psychiatry, and the Female Brain. Big topics.
Huge. And it starts by acknowledging that old mind-body split idea and how it's affected these fields.
But the core message seems to be that prevalence, symptoms, progression of disorders, they can differ between sexes.
And critically, for some conditions in women, symptoms can wax and wane with the menstrual cycle.
Okay, let's break it down. Neurology first. Chronic headaches.
Much more common in women before menopause, especially migraines. Estrogen withdrawal is a known trigger.
But they often get better during pregnancy.
Often, yes. And some research found lower levels of the body's own cannabinoids and also serotonin in headache sufferers.
Stroke.
Similar overall incidence maybe, but potential differences in severity or the type of symptoms, maybe more weakness reported in women, and migraine with aura is a risk factor in younger women.
Chronic pain.
Evidence suggests women may have lower pain thresholds generally. And again, sensitivity might vary across the cycle. Animal studies support this.
Stress response, HPA axis.
Mentioned, but not detailed regarding sex differences in this particular chapter.
Sleep. Insomnia.
More common in women. Again, potential links to hormonal shifts are considered.
Multiple sclerosis.
MS, definitely more prevalent in females. It's an autoimmune condition. The book discusses immune cells, Th1, Th2 balance.
And the pregnancy effect is really striking, right? Fewer relapses during, more after.
Very striking. Strongly suggests hormonal influences on the immune processes underlying MS.
Epilepsy.
Can be linked to the cycle catamenial epilepsy. Estrogen and progesterone seem to have complex, sometimes opposing effects on seizure thresholds in animal models.
And planning before pregnancy is vital for women with epilepsy.
Absolutely, due to potential drug effects and changes in how drugs are handled.
Parkinson's disease.
Slightly less common in women, often later onset. Some women report symptoms worsening at certain cycle times or during pregnancy.
And Alzheimer's disease in aging.
More common in women, also later onset generally. The book describes the classic plaques and tangles, loss of acetylcholine, discusses genetic risks too, but also presents findings like from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging.
Suggesting estrogen replacement therapy, Earth HRT, might be protective. Lower risk, later onset.
Some studies pointed that way, yes. A potential protective role for estrogen was a major area of interest.
Okay, shifting to psychiatry. Depression.
Roughly twice as frequent in females, likely a genetic component, but the book notes the common idea that menopause directly causes depression isn't strongly backed by evidence.
Interesting. Anxiety disorders.
Some types, like Panic disorder, OCD, social phobia are more common in females. Again, genetics likely play a role. And some women with OCD find symptoms worsen cyclically.
Schizophrenia.
Often reported as less severe, better prognosis, later onset in females, except maybe familial types. A protective role for estrogen has been suggested based on animal work.
But late-onset schizophrenia is actually more common in women.
Yes, possibly linked to estrogen declining later in life.
PTSD.
Similar overall rates, but the common triggers often differ. Assault for women, combat for men, typically.
Suicide is linked to depression and eating disorders.
Anorexia, bulimia, much more common in females.
Wow, that's a lot of differences across the board.
It really highlights how sex is a crucial biological variable in brain health.
Okay, almost there. The next to last chapter tackles pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. Basically how drugs work in the body.
Right. Pharmacokinetics is what the body does to the drug absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, ADME.
Like that first pass metabolism in the liver for pills.
Exactly, a key step. And pharmacodynamics is what the drug does to the body, its effects.
And the big caveat here is
The historical exclusion of women from drug trials. So much of the human data specifically on sex differences is limited. We often rely on animal studies.
but what we do know suggests differences, like drug metabolism changing across a menstrual cycle.
There's evidence for that, yeah. Particularly involving liver enzymes, the cytochrome P450 system, like the CYP3A4 isoform.
Though the data isn't always perfectly clear.
It can be conflicting between lab-niche studies and studies in people, but for certain drugs, changes in metabolism linked to the cycle have been reported.
What of the blood-brain barrier, getting drugs into the brain?
Limited evidence, but hints that permeability might differ slightly between sexes for some specific drugs or markers. Needs more research.
And the book mentions estrogen receptors being found near glutamate receptors, like NMDA receptors.
Yeah, co-localization. Suggests potential interactions relevant for drug development, maybe for stroke drugs targeting NMDA receptors. Though one study noted female rats had worse outcomes with a specific NMDA blocker, it's complex.
But it revisits hormone replacement therapy, HRT.
Looking at its effects in the context of these disorders. For Alzheimer's, again, studies suggesting reduced risk, later onset, maybe better response to some treatments with HRT. Evidence is more limited there. Animal studies suggesting benefit, some questionnaire data hinting at symptom relief in postmenopausal women on HRT. Still, that complex interplay of estrogen-progesterone on seizures emphasizes careful management, especially during pregnancy, due to drug handling changes and risks to the fetus from some anti-epileptics.
Anxiety drugs.
Many target that GABA receptor we mentioned. Steroids might enhance GABA effects. Others, like buspirone, work differently on serotonin receptors.
Antipsychotics for psychosis.
Females often reported as more sensitive, better response sometimes, but also more severe side effects like tardive dyskinesia. Estrogen levels might play a role.
Alcohol.
Females tend to reach higher blood alcohol levels for the same amount consumed, even though they might eliminate it slightly faster. And alcohol-related damage can progress quicker in women.
Plus the huge risks during pregnancy, fetal alcohol syndrome.
Absolutely critical to emphasize. And cannabis. Cognitive issues with heavy use, risks during pregnancy, and breastfeeding.
Okay, final chapter. Into the 21st century. Bringing it all together.
Yeah, it basically reiterates the evidence stacks up. There are structural and functional brain differences between sexes, differences in disorder susceptibility, differences in drug responses.
Mentions that New Scientist article suggesting two kinds of human brain.
It does, a provocative idea summing up the accumulating evidence.
It also uses the NMDA receptor story as an example of how science progresses from basic discovery to more nuance.
And importantly, it connects these scientific findings back to societal biases, referencing historical views of women.
And pointing out that even now, successful women can face subtle or overt prejudice.
Right. Despite progress, those biases can linger.
So, wrapping this deep dive up for our listener, key takeaways.
Well, I'd say, 1, the science presented here strongly suggests real structural brain differences exist, gray-white matter proportions, symmetry. 2, functional differences seem clear too, how emotions or language might be processed differently.
And 3,
3, the impact of fluctuating hormones in females is profound, and sex differences in neurological and psychiatric disorders are significant and need attention.
and the relevance for you, listening. Why care?
Because fundamentally, this challenges that old, simplistic, one-size-fits-all view of the brain.
Right. It gives us new angles on health, behavior learning.
Exactly. It could impact medicine, psychology, education, even just how we understand ourselves and each other. It's knowledge that can reframe a lot.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
If these biological distinctions are real, how do our societies, our healthcare, our schools need to evolve?
To truly serve everyone effectively.
Yeah. And what do these underlying biological differences mean for how we interpret the vast range of human behaviors and experiences? It definitely gives you something to think about.